Test. 皆様お待たせしました。自己紹介の後で。So imagine that you like to play Pokemon Go, and since you're a big fan, you're going to an international Pokemon Go meeting in 2 weeks' time. You're looking forward to talking to people from all over the world about your favorite characters. However, their names in English are quite different from their names in Japanese. With only 2 weeks left, how can you learn the names in the most efficient way possible? Today's presentation will answer this question. So the goals of this talk are two. First, to discuss memory from a scientific point of view, and to this end, I define two phenomena from the scientific study of memory, namely the spacing effect and the generation effect. And based on those phenomena, I show two learning approaches which have largest impact on remembering. And the second goal of this talk is to introduce you to Anki, which is a program to help you memorize things efficiently. Let's look at the word itself, memorizing, since it's usually associated negatively with learning without really understanding. However, according to the dictionary, memorize simply means to commit to memory, and memorizing forms a solid basis and foundation for higher level of thinking and problem solving. So today we talk about this part of learning that mainly concerns with memorizing facts and concepts. And before applying the methods that I showed today, one has to answer the question, is memorizing the right tool for learning in this particular case? And examples when it is art history, geography, studying long poems, nutrition facts, or in my case, I use it for studying language vocabulary. Next, we would like to think about human memory. Lord Kelvin has said that if you cannot measure it, you cannot really improve it. So let's see how we can assess human memory. On the figure is a simplified model of the mind. Stimuli enter from the environment into the working memory, which is where thinking happens. Through the process of learning, information is transferred from the working memory to the long-term memory. And this is the site where factual knowledge is stored. Whenever we're remembering, we're retrieving information from the long-term memory to the working memory. And when this retrieval process fails, we say that we have forgotten. So to assess the long-term memory, let's look at it from an information system point of view. We have to answer three questions, namely, how quickly can information enter the system, how much information can be stored in total, and how quickly is information lost. And in the case of human memory, the second question is trivially answered, since the capacity is enormous. So let's first look at the first question and think about the rate of learning. The German psychologist Ebbinghaus was a pioneer in the scientific study of memory, and he only ever tested one subject, namely himself. He created many lists containing 16 so-called nonsense syllables, and you can see example of what they look like at the side of the graph. They were pronounceable, but they didn't really have any real meaning, and in this way he could eliminate any influence from his prior knowledge in the experiment. What the experiment consisted in was, on a first day, he would repeat many times out loud a fresh list of 16 syllables. 8 repetitions took about 1 minute, and he would do between 8 and 64 repetitions. Then the second day, he would check how much he had learned, and he used the time that it took to relearn the syllables. Reshare.
you check the Wi-Fi status?
Oh no, I'm on the Ethernet because
Yeah.
I know these things fail. So there is internet.
No problem.
Yeah. No, I'm on the Ethernet to be fail safe. I'm using the Ethernet.
Is that okay though?
Yes.
なぜこれはインターネットを経由してシェアするからそこは大丈夫なはずなんですけど画面が出てない。
There is
Can you share?
um, okay. Thanks for checking this.
Okay, we have a screen.
Oh, it's okay. Thank you for checking. Sorry for the interruption. So on the first day he studied, he repeated many times to himself a fresh list of 16 nonsense syllables. And the second day he would check how much of the list had remembered. And he used the time that it took to restudy the list again as a proxy for this information. It turned out that the more he repeated the list on the first day, the less time he needed to relearn it on the second day. So there is a simple linear relationship between the time devoted to study and the results on the next day. There is a second result out of this experiment, namely the spacing effect. If you look at two instances of the experiment, which I have marked on the plot, and calculate how much time the repetitions took on the first day, and sum this time with the time needed to relearn on the second day, you would see that the total time for the experiments is not always the same. This phenomenon was named the spacing effect, and a consequence of it is that rather than massing reviews together, one should distribute them over time in order to save from study time. Now that we have answered the first question about how quickly information enters the system, let's focus our attention on information lost or forgetting. In a different experiment, Ebbinghaus again used the same nonsense syllables. He would repeat them on the first day, and then he would test himself on after a larger period of time had elapsed, and this period was ranging between 2 and 31 days. Once he plotted the result of the experiment, what is shown is the so-called forgetting curve, which leads us to conclude that the new knowledge decays exponentially fast, unless, however, this knowledge is reinforced. So unless we use our new knowledge, we're probably going to lose it, with up to 75% of new information being lost in the first 2 days of study. Additional results on forgetting come from the field of biological neuroscience. However, these are not very definitive because this is a very active area of research. It is believed, however, that a memory in the brain is a pattern of connections between neurons, and each neuron can participate in many such memory networks. The new memories are fragile since connections between the neurons are weak, and any information overloading can distort or erase the memories. So in order to optimize our learning, we can set 2 goals to ourselves. The first one would be to minimize the total time spent learning. And I have briefly touched upon this when I discussed the spacing effect. I will come back to this later. And the second goal is to maximize retention or to minimize forgetting. And next I will talk about this. A first method to combat forgetting is the so-called spaced repetition technique, which is based on the spacing effect. It basically says that you're better off distributing your practice over time rather than studying multiple times in a single session. And on the figure is shown in blue, the original forgetting curve from Ebbinghaus experiment, in case no review was made whatsoever. And the red curves depict how memory fades in case of 1, 2, or 3 reviews. And we can see that the forgetting pattern is improved. Are we on? Okay. So additional result from neuroscience on forgetting shows that neuron connections are strengthened if a stimulus is repeated several times with intervals of inactivity in between the stimuli. A second way that we could use to modify, to improve on the forgetting pattern is the so-called generation effect. In this experiment, 4 groups of students were required to study language pairs. And the experiment was conducted over 2 days. On the first day was the learning phase, and 1 week later was a testing phase to see how much the students remembered. What is important for us is that the first 2 groups of students during their learning phase, they were tested. So they were not only shown the language pairs, but they were required to produce a correct answer. The second 2 groups were not tested. During learning, there was no difference in the learning speed between the 4 groups, and all of them managed to successfully learn. However, when tested 1 week later, it turned out that the 2 groups who were tested during the learning process could remember as much as 80% of the information, while the 2 groups that were not tested performed comparatively much poorer, with only 35% of the new information remembered. This phenomena was called the generation effect because there was a requirement for the learner to generate the correct answer rather than simply observe it. And based on this effect, a study technique called active recall is defined, where the learner has to effortfully produce an answer from memory, and this helps to improve on the forgetting pattern. Paper flashcards, with which you're probably familiar, require active recall. The learner is first presented with a stimulus. This is a hint or a question they have to answer, and next they mentally prepare a response. In this phase, the learner has to carefully think about the answer and not just passively receive the correct answer. And lastly, they compare their response to the correct answer. So far, we have seen 2 techniques to improve learning. The first one is spaced repetition, which is based on the spacing effect. And the second one is called active recall, which is based on the generation effect. It required testing during the learning process in order to remember better. Let's now see learning methodology that combines the two principles. The Leitner paper flashcard system separated the flashcards into multiple boxes. During learning, the learner retrieved one card from the box and, in case of success, moved the card to an upper box, and in case of failure, put it back in the first box to be relearned. After a card was successfully remembered from the fifth box, it was removed from the set and it wasn't learned again, because according to Leitner, this information would be remembered forever. This was certainly improvement over the traditional sequential study with flashcards, but timing-wise, this method is very rough and cannot give you exact review dates for the cards, as well as it manages very poorly information, which has a varying difficulty level. Anki is a system that implements smart flashcards. It is a software that implements the spaced repetition system, and it adaptively adjusts the review interval for every flashcard based on the user performance. I was glad to hear that some of you already know the system and use it. It is open source and multi-platform. It's very flexible and customizable, and it has the largest user base with about 4 million people who use Anki. Before I show it to you, I will just give a quick overview. In Anki, we have cards, notes, decks, and collections. A note contains all the information for a given item, which you input into 2 or more fields. Based on rules that you define, from these fields, multiple cards are generated, which is very convenient, since if you have a mistake, you can edit only once the note, and all the cards will get the update. And also you can see at a glance all the information for an item. A deck contains all the notes and cards for a given topic, and collection is all decks, media, cards, and scheduling information that you have in Anki. For adding study material, it's best if you create your own decks, and for this you can add as a content of the notes text, media, or LaTeX. And to style the cards, you can use HTML and CSS. And now I will attempt to show you the system itself. So I have already input some decks into Anki. By default, there is a default deck. And since I promised you the Pokemons, here they are. This is the card browser, where you can select the decks and see at a glance what the information in a note is. So this is a single note for one of the characters, and I have put the Japanese name, the English name, an image, and some extra field. And based on this note information, here are the cards that have been generated. To change the fields and their order, you go here. And it also supports languages which are written from right to left. I won't be adding any new fields since we don't have much time. And to define the rules for generating the cards based on the information in the notes, you go here. Up here is the template for the question part, and you can write the name of the field between curly braces. And here you see the preview, what it will look like. And up there is the template for the back, which by default also includes the question, then a line, and then the correct answer for your card. You can use CSS here for styling both cards, and you can also embed CSS in the front and back templates. I have defined 2 cards, Japanese to English and English to Japanese. And if I want to define a new card, I would go here. By default, Anki just clones the currently selected template. So code this image to English, since our goal was to study the English names of the characters. And here I input the image. And I immediately see the preview of the question part of the card. And here would be what you see once you have given your answer. So for adding content, you go here, you input all the fields. And this is the preferred more way to study, since by adding content, you get context for your information and you can think carefully about what is really worth remembering. However, if you don't have time or you don't feel like adding content yourself, there is a online server where people can upload their decks. The largest number of categories are in the language study, but there is also a fair amount of information on science and art. Some of the decks that I have selected to show are the classical music themes with their answers. If you want to drill yourself, countries with the language that is spoken, and whatever the creator of the deck thought was useful. Prefectures of Japan, and I already know quite a bit. The outtakes from the US naturalization test, which is something that is information that's available on the government page, but is very cumbersome to curate. And if you need to take the test, this would be important. It has questions like, how can Americans participate in their democracy? A very good deck on chemical elements, and it's up to date, so Nihonium is in it. And of course, there is plenty of information on the Pokemons. So you can use the shared decks. Quickly about studying, there is, you can see the new cards, which is information you have entered, but you haven't studied yet. Learning and relearning cards are those that are not yet well mastered. And 2 review cards were already studied once, but you need to revise them. You rate yourself, and there is one option to claim that you have completely forgotten, and 3 rates of having remembered: hard, good, or easy. Only performance on the review cards modifies Anki's scheduling algorithm. Let's see what the scheduling is like. As the memory gets stronger with each successful recall, intervals between reviews can increase. So we can see here a forgetting curve with expanding review intervals. And basically this allows us to minimize the time that we spend on learning. Although Anki is great, not types of knowledge are suitable to be studied with it. For example, complex information that requires abstract thinking or deeper understanding is not. And similar systems are just a learning aid and cannot replace a teacher and a textbook. Also, the scheduling algorithm is not quite so perfect and cannot manage well if you stop studying for a while and then you try to go back to it, but you've completely forgotten some of the information. Extra features which I did not cover, but are still awesome, are support for clauses, add-ons, and filter decks. Please come and talk to me if you're interested in them. Although I mentioned Anki is not suitable for technical information, to my surprise, I found that someone used Anki to teach themselves programming. So everybody has their own take on how to study. And a PhD student won a lot of money on an American trivia show using data mining to collect questions and then Anki to remember their answers. These are some very resources that I found useful, but I won't go into detail now. So to wrap up, memorizing is an important tool in the learning process. I have shown the spacing effect, which requires you to split your study into multiple sessions that rather than massing your study together, and this reduces the overall learning time. And a learning technique based on that is the spaced repetition. And a second phenomena of memory that I discussed was the generation effect, which consisted in the effortful production of an answer from memory. And the learning technique based on it is active recall. Anki applies these two most successful learning techniques to help you memorize facts and concepts efficiently. Thank you for your attention and patience, and please remember how not to forget. Maybe. Yes, I do.
So do you type in all the stuff yourself, or do you use some shared deck?
I type all the stuff myself, and for kanji, a shared deck.
My question is in Anki, so can we configure some same firebox?
Oh, as the simpler Leitner technique, you could actually modify the study intervals so that it behaves exactly the same as a digital version of the Leitner method, but this is not so good as the Anki method, because Anki allows you to increase the intervals between study. So in principle, you can implement a digital version of the Leitner method using Anki, because you're allowed to modify all the parameters of the system.
After the testing system?
Of the learning system as well.
Okay.
So sounds like the name of the system Anki originated from
Japanese, it did, yes.
the developer has something to do with the Japanese culture. How
Develop.
this products what you
As far as I know, developer is not Japanese, but he is based in Japan right now, and maybe he's an aficionado of the culture. However, from what I know, the word Anki in Japanese doesn't have so good connotation. It means learning without really understanding. That's why I wanted to clarify that. It's not necessarily about studying by heart.
Another question is that in the parameters like the scheduling and the cycle depended on the individuals. I mean, individuals require the shorter.
Yes, so you can modify those parameters based on what you discover are the best study patterns for you.
And how do you find the best parameter?
In my personal case, if I found that I need, during learning, that I have to many times press again, it probably meant that the interval was too long. So I need shorter intervals in order to remember better.
Any other question? Thank you for your presentation.
ありがとうございました。